دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء قسما بالله رب العالمين ما ارتضينا غير دين الله دين فهو دين الحق دين الأنبياء إنه الإسلام نور وضياء
هذا الدر وهذه الكلم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me today on the ITV networks with a very special young guest. As I've always said and maintained throughout the series, that the young people of South Africa are perhaps the greatest sign of hope that we have for this country. Their imagination, their creativity, their innovation, their dynamism, and most important of all, the intellectual capacity and capability is something to look forward to aspire to, and to find hope in. With that, I'd like to introduce my very special guest, Siseko Khumalo, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Pretoria. He's also a master's student and has achieved tremendous amount of, what shall I say, potential in the short time that he's been in the academic field. So with that, I'd like to say welcome and thank you, Siseko, for making this time for me.
Thank you, Quraysha, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a beautiful setting, it's a beautiful time, but also it is a time of reflection and mourning in South Africa and in Palestine. I would like to start firstly by informing my guests that we would today mourn the deaths of the many victims in Palestine, specifically in Gaza during the March of Return, where the apartheid state, the Zionist apartheid state of Israel, killed close to 19 Palestinians and injured more than 700. Yet these were peacefully protesting students, people and individual civilians from all walks of life who had come to ask or to reclaim their land. The land issue is a big issue in Palestine as it is in South Africa, and at the same time we mourn the passing of the mother of our nation, Winnie Madikizela Mandela. Winnie also stood for the Palestinian people, for the right of their struggle, and supported the Palestinian struggle. The struggles in South Africa and Palestine have been parallel. It is a case of fighting for land, a fight against oppression, a fight against injustice, and for reclaiming your rights, not for asking for those human rights, because human rights belong to everybody and no one should confer it upon you, because then it means that somebody is better than you. But it is about reclaiming those rights. And in South Africa, we had the same situation during apartheid, and in many instances continues in this state that we are in right now, the neo-apartheid state of South Africa. We have not transcended those exploitations. So with that introduction, Siseko, I would like to get your feelings and your thoughts about the passing of the Mama Winnie and the mother of the nation. Surely she is somebody that we should reflect on, because such a title, the mother of the nation, does not come willy-nilly, nor is it haphazardly bestowed upon a person. What are your feelings about Mama Winnie?
You know, when I first learnt of her passing, I learnt of it from a friend, and I thought, no, maybe this is a joke, maybe this is because I believe it was just after April Fool's, or it was during April Fool's that she passed, and so I quickly went online, and you know, there's always the question of which particular media sources do you read?
Exactly, yeah.
You've got to corroborate the story, and you've got to find which are the more trustworthy news sources. And Eyewitness News had put up the story, and there was a story on the Herald, and it sunk in me that, you know, there's a beautiful song by what's his name again? The poet, the people's poet. What's his name? The old guy, Mzwakembuli. And he says that he's got one particular song where he celebrates the old names, the great names, and in there he says, "Akotema maqhawekazi, zihambile izinsizwa, zisele izibongo, amagugu aleli izwe ayosala emathuneni." And basically what he's saying there is that, you know, the people who have made history, the people who have really etched, I would say maybe a thought, a grain of the passing of time into history, yes, they will depart, but their names will remain with us. And for me, that is the one main thing that I take away from Mama's passing, you know, is that the contribution she made to this country, the contribution that she made to the legacy of the ANC, the contribution that she made to so many people, to so many South Africans, and the image that she became, you know, becoming the mother of the nation. Her passing leaves me, in a sense, very mournful. And again, as you say, she's not an individual, or she was not an individual rather, who just only looked at particularities or the South African context, but rather shared sort of our experiences with other people. And of course, her solidarity with the Palestinians is something that we look to, you know, in terms of how she was able to broaden the concept of freedom, not only just to the South African context, but appealed to everybody and anybody, wherever there is oppression, in a sense. You know, she stood against that. And for me, that is something that she leaves behind, and a memory that I think should last, not only for us, but for our children and our great-grandchildren, for that matter.
And it's wonderful that you say that, because there's a huge contestation in the South African social media and on the mainstream media at the moment, because there is this, this duality. On the one hand, you have the white mainstream media trying to portray her and her life, focusing only on the negatives, and on the other hand, there's the recalling of history, because you mention history here, and history generally is written in the pen of the victor. And so whoever still controls the medium of dissemination and communication will portray a particular story, a particular narrative, and then it is upon those who are occupied, those who are conquered, the colonized peoples, to carry forth their own particular history. And Mama Winnie's history, what is special about it, which I find very telling about her, and which speaks volumes about her character, is that she's one of the few, if not maybe the only one, of the ANC, of the old Kader community per se, who has still remained in the township. She didn't move out into the white suburban areas, that she stayed in and amongst and with the people, and has always been, and it was known as a figure of empathy. And empathy is telling in terms of your character and your activism.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you mentioned the fact that she remains in the township, because just yesterday I met up with a colleague of mine, Ustembi Lembete. She's in the politics department, and has very close relations in terms of family with Madikizela Mandela's life. And the one thing that she keeps on pointing out as we reminisce on Mama's contribution to South Africa, is the fact that she says that, you know, Mama's always there, or rather she was always there.
Her presence was always
exactly.
there. Yeah.
In the community, she goes to, and she was just saying that, you know, she was last weekend, she was at church during the Easter services, and she was always amongst the people. She was always, whenever there was a passing or a death in the local community, she would be there as a local community member. And of course, let's not forget that, in a sense, her empathy comes from her social work training, because that's what she was trained as, right? And in a sense that then influences the way that she relates to her community. So, and I think this is telling in a sense, because a lot of the contemporary South African cadres become these political stalwarts and become these valorized leaders of society, and that's quite telling about the fact that they don't necessarily lead from a position of empathy, which is where she led from. And this is why she then becomes the mother of the nation. And the contestations, of course, between, you know, particular quarters of society that define her on the one hand as, or put up a negative conception of her, I think they misunderstand, or rather, in a sense, what I'm reminded of at this point is the concept of love. And Mama's love was a radical love. It was a love that could not stand injustice and oppression.
So you do what needs to be done to protect those that you love,
exactly.
Isn't it? Yes.
Exactly.
And that is a survival instinct, in my opinion.
Precisely. And you know, it's a radical love, because and it's telling about our society and how our society has developed and sort of generated over the past couple of years, where we have lost that sense of love, where we have lost that sense of empathy, where it becomes a job. And for her, it wasn't a job. It was always the children of the ANC, the children of the next black parent, the children who are in exile, the children who are fighting a system of oppression and injustice. And for her, it was espousing a love that would overcome that injustice, a love that would respond to that injustice with love. And yes, sometimes love is corrective. You know, as a child, your parents love you, but you do something wrong and you get a little smack on the butt and say, no, actually you don't do that.
But what you remind me of is the control, the hegemonic control of the narrative, and also of what is allowed, which shows the constraints or the limitations on, for example, freedom of speech or freedom of the academia. So this radical love that you speak about, I would say, is also in the case of radical contestation. It's okay, it's welcome and it's allowed in terms of art, for example, or music or whatever. But the minute you use this radical contestation to take on power, then, oh, you're impinging upon something, or excuse me, you need to re-evaluate or you need to check. So it is how also the expression of this radical love, this radical contestation is in a way manipulated or controlled by people who want to make sure that the status quo remains, but as if to allow a voice for the black person or the speaking from the voiceless. And that is what you have written about recently, I think, in terms of your article, Decoloniality and Indigeneity. But we're going to come to that. We only have a minute before we go to a break. And whilst you were speaking about Mama and her extreme sense of love, I think many people lose sight of this, that emotion plays a very important part in struggle.
Absolutely. And that's the one thing that comes up again and again in the 1960s, in the 1980s, in the 1970s. It is the love. It is the love of education in 1976 that took students to the streets to resist oppression. It is the love of education that took students in 2016 to the streets on our campuses to resist the colonial impositions and the epistemic paradigms that continue to reign within our institutions. And it is that love, it is that emotion that says, I have a desire, a yearning desire to learn, and yet there are these impositions. I have a yearning desire to be a human being and for my humanity to be recognized, but there are these imposing structures, and that is what I think Mam Winnie teaches us as she parts.
And it's ironic that we see it that way, but the narrative is, it is the desire for violence. It is the desire or the anger within the black people that has brought them to this, or it is violence of the black person per se. But we're going to carry this conversation further. We'll see you after the break.
بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم بمديح الهادي تنتظم ضاءت بالمختار الظلم وحلا في مولده النغم.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment today, and finding me in the ITV networks with my very special guest, Siseko Khumalo, and we're speaking generally about the situation in South Africa. We're speaking about Mama Winnie, and of course about decoloniality and decolonization in the academia. Siseko, as you were speaking about Mama Winnie, and you spoke about her empathy, and you spoke also about the politicians of today, the political cadres, etc., who have become distant, where Mama Winnie stayed in the township, was a woman of the people, and has always remained a person of the people. The others, the black elite, have become in a way distanced from those whom they claim to represent. My question to you then, isn't that also true of the academics today, of many black academics who have entered the academia, who have entered positions or have been bestowed with positions as vice chancellor, as whatever, individuals who have now come into this particular these prestigious appointments, and they look upon themselves as being a part of this very prestigious or privileged fold, become distant also because many of them have moved out of the townships, live in the suburban areas, take basically their instructions still very much from a white academia, from white corporates, and in a way, as the academics get involved in the westernized University of South Africa at the moment, they begin to lose that particular sight, that vision, which is telling of what Mama did and of a reflection of the people of whom she represented. Because once you distance yourself from them, eventually that blood gets severed, that emotion begins to fade away, and then you write from an intellectual perspective. You try to put everything in a rational viewpoint, which is what the Enlightenment did and spoke about scientific knowledge, and then you slowly sever the politicization of the issue from the logic. Don't you feel that that is happening a lot in the academia in South Africa as well?
I think That is a very poignant contribution and a poignant point. And of course, this is much of the stuff that has been written about in decolonial scholarship. Because, of course, it becomes... I always remember Thuli Madonsela's report on Gandla, Secure in Comfort, the title. And that's the thing with academics and intellectuals, especially black intellectuals, you know, we become quite secure in comfort, we become complacent. In fact, we become so invested in the status quo that we cannot change the status quo ourselves. And again, this is, as you say, the very scientific discourses that we use, right? So the jargon that strips away the political identity of the project, why it is that we find ourselves in positions of the intellectual, why it is that we find ourselves in positions of the academy. And I'm just going to use a simple anecdote here. For instance, my mother's a teacher, and she's an English teacher, and she made education look like she made teaching look like a superhero job.
Right.
And I thought...
But it is. Sorry
it is, of course.
to interrupt there. It certainly is. It is a superhero job.
So she made education look like a superhero job, and I thought, you know what? I actually want to be a superhero. And luckily enough, I had a black female superhero that I could look up to every single day, who used to come home and who made education look so beautiful. And this is one of the reasons why I then find myself in education. This is one of the reasons why I find myself in my research thinking around issues of educational desire and educational attainment. What does that mean for a contemporary black student? What does it mean for a contemporary black student who's coming into the academy who has so many barriers to cross? Language, cultural identity, institutional culture, all of those things which are alienating to the student. And for me, it's that educational desire, right? And when we climb the ladder, when we begin to climb the corporate ladder of the academy, what happens is that we forget those little anecdotes, we forget those little stories, we forget why it is we fell in love with the project of teaching, learning and research, subsequently the university in its entirety. And that's something that's very sad, and I would hope that in future that is something that we don't lose. I would hope that it's something that continues to inspire and inflect our work as intellectuals.
I think that also part of that comes to what you were telling me earlier as to why you wrote this particular paper, and that is the dressing up of the university to pretend that there is this whole process of transformation and decolonization going on in the university. But at the same time, I also have another issue, and this problem is, what Fanon spoke about, the black skins, white masks, where the academia is intentionally pulling in people whom they can manipulate. So, for instance, I had a very good friend and colleague who worked with me for many years in the university, and he always said that for black people, it's very difficult to contest the hand that feeds you. And so if you're getting this opportunity and you're more likely to toe the line because this is where you're getting your bread from. So in many instances, you compromise your values and your ethics in order for survival, and that is in terms of income. Do you find that in contesting this, there needs to be a very strong individual personality and of course a support structure from within you and around you in order to contest this? Or do you think that for black people to contest this window dressing that is part of its transformation or decolonization of the university is a very difficult struggle?
It is a very difficult struggle. It is an exceptionally difficult struggle because, number one, the first thing that the university does when you come in as a first-year student into the university, you get taught how to think. This is how we think. This is the procedure with which we think. Now, one of the things that I would say distinguishes me, and it still continues to distinguish me, is the fact that I resist authority. And that's the reason why I'm so scared of a school environment. I really am. The bell puts the fear of God in me, and the uniform even more so. Because I don't want to toe the line. I don't want to be told how to think. I want to look at an idea, run with that idea, get inspired by that idea, get beaten up by that idea, beat that idea up myself. And in that there's a process of learning that takes place. But what the culture is in terms of teaching and learning in the university space, you don't think like that here, right? That's what we get told, or that's what our students get told. That's not how you think here. This is not the way that things are done. We have a disciplinary perspective, and Foucault talks about this, right? And there's subsequent research and subsequent scholarship that has spoken to this, where the discipline becomes the disciplinary mechanism, right? Where the discipline begins to now mold you into the scholar that you need to become. So as much as you're trying not to bite the hand that feeds you, there's also the disciplinary mechanisms that the institution uses because of epistemic impositions, right? To say that's not how you think. We don't address those questions. So for instance, in South Africa, there are so many issues that plague our local communities, black communities. And here I'm using black in the sense of black consciousness, right? There's so many issues that plague our black communities. And yet only recently, it's been in 2012, 2010 onwards, that we've actually said as black intellectuals, we are going to go to our local communities. Our issues are going to be the issues that inflect our masters, that inflect our PhD dissertations, that inflect our research. Only now have we turned to this particular perspective of saying, no, we're actually not going to think about Europe because we're sick and tired of thinking about Europe. We're sick and tired of importing these ideas. We're going to think from our own local dispositions. So as much as you try not to bite the hand that feeds you, there are also these, in a sense, curative mechanisms that say, this is what a scholar looks like. This is how you're supposed to think. And that, of course, feeds into the co-optation of blackness, into maintaining systems of injustice and oppression within the university space through prioritizing particular identities, particular narratives, particular ways of thinking. And so, yes, there has to be the individual voice. There has to be a support structure and a network. And we also have to be confident in saying we do have stories to tell, and our stories are legitimate, and our stories are meaningful.
So we're almost at the end, and I'm going to put two more last questions to you, but we'll come back with the second interview. The first question is that you speak about black individuals speaking up and intellectuals standing up also, and that is a very positive development, I would say. But the problem now is, my question is that South Africa is not only of black academics and black intellectuals. There are many white academics and white intellectuals who also occupy this space. The same voices that are claiming that South Africa belongs to them as well. If that is the case, then shouldn't they also be at that point, or should have begun a while ago, to say, let's inflect on the South African issue, let's reflect, let's move away from this northern gaze and focus on what matters to us, because if it matters to the black community, it matters to us because we are part of South Africa. But I don't see much of that, but perhaps I could be wrong, and maybe you can correct me on that. And the second one I want you to end off for us was, when you speak about this desire for knowledge, this why, the superhero vision that is beginning to evaporate, is it because we're losing focus of our identity and on who we are? And then we misunderstand the three very general concepts. One is information, that you're going to university, you're going to school, but you get a whole lot of information. And then you get knowledge, and knowledge is about informing you about what is right and wrong. But ultimately, we're not getting to the final point, which is wisdom, the ability to act on that which is right and that which is wrong. And that is perhaps a great failure of the education system.
Absolutely. On the first point, definitely, a lot of our white colleagues have not done that work of looking into our local issues and our local problems. And this is something that I bring up in one of my papers that I'm hoping to get published, where I'm talking about the African vocabulary, a lexicon of sorts where it's not necessarily an African language, but it becomes a set of tools that we use within the academy to think through what Louis Nkosi in 1989 calls the African landscape, the South African landscape. How do we respond to the South African landscape? What about poverty? What about inequality? What about unemployment? And that is a question that white intellectuals have not yet addressed, and if they do, they address it very superficially. On the question of wisdom, I think that that is where philosophy fails us currently, I think. And as a student of philosophy myself, I believe that's something that's really, really important, where we have to drive that question of wisdom. And what does it look like? How do we understand wisdom? And how do we use this knowledge to really respond from a position of wisdom, love, and care to our local situations? And we divorce philosophy from the political agency by saying it's knowledge for knowledge's sake. That in itself is a political ideology, and I think that that's problematic.
So thank you very much for sharing these ideas with me, but we're coming back and we'll see you next week, where I ask Siseko very many challenging questions. The first begins with the name of Rhodes University. But till then, thank you, Siseko. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
قسما بالله رب